Hey there, and welcome to a deep dive into a fascinating and honestly, like, often misunderstood world.
Hmm.
High-masking autism. You know, we all put on, different faces throughout our day, right? Like
Right.
friend, coworker, maybe even karaoke star. But for some people, that putting on a face thing
Yeah.
is so much more than just a choice.
Right.
And that's what these articles that you shared from Cheap ABA,
Hmm.
it really got me thinking about this.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
Um, High-masking autism is often about navigating a world that isn't always built for neurodiversity.
Right.
So individuals adapt, right? They create this mask to kind of blend in.
And that makes sense, right? We've all probably felt that pressure to fit in at some point.
Yeah.
But what these articles really highlight is the cost of that constant adaptation,
Right.
the mental energy it takes to maintain that mask
Yeah.
day in and day out.
Yeah.
And it's not about being fake.
Right.
It's a way of surviving. Of coping in a world that doesn't always understand.
Exactly. And that survival mechanism, while understandable, can have some serious consequences.
Yeah.
The articles point out that high masking doesn't mean low support needs.
Right.
In fact, it often means that those needs are just hidden beneath the surface.
Okay, so let's unpack that. So
Yeah.
you sent over these articles, I'm diving in, and there's this example of an autistic person at a work event. And they're engaging, they're telling jokes, they seem perfectly fine.
Right.
But what we don't see is that internally they're meticulously analyzing social cues.
Right.
They're suppressing their natural impulses to stim,
Yeah.
essentially running a mental marathon just to keep up.
And that image, that mental marathon, is so powerful because it illustrates the invisible exhaustion that many high-masking autistic individuals experience.
Yeah.
The articles actually compare it to the cognitive load of a full workday,
Wow.
which is incredible to think about.
It really makes you question those assumptions that we make based on outward behavior, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like, just because someone appears fine
Right.
doesn't mean they are. They might be drowning, but they're just really good at holding their breath.
And eventually you can only hold your breath for so long.
Right.
And the articles do a great job of outlining those potential consequences.
Yeah.
The ones we don't always see. The burnout,
Yeah.
the anxiety, the impact on identity.
Let's dive into those because the articles mention 3 major struggles
Yeah.
that really resonated with me.
Okay.
Mental exhaustion,
Mm-hmm.
social anxiety,
Right.
and identity issues.
Yeah.
Let's start with the mental exhaustion piece.
Hmm.
What does that actually look like for someone who's high masking?
Imagine this. You're at work, maybe in a meeting, and you're hit with this wave of exhaustion. That feels like you just pulled an all-nighter,
Yeah.
but you haven't.
Right.
Your brain feels fried, you're struggling to process information,
Hmm.
and all you want to do is disappear. That feeling, that's the reality for many high-masking autistic individuals,
Right.
even after what might seem like a relatively normal social interaction.
It's like that feeling of coming home after a long day of travel.
Uh-huh.
That sense of relief when you can finally take off your shoes. But for someone who's constantly masking,
Mm-hmm.
that home doesn't really exist, does it?
No.
The mask stays on.
Exactly. And that constant on state, that inability to truly unwind and recharge can have a cumulative effect,
Right.
leading to burnout,
Mm-hmm.
increased anxiety, even physical symptoms.
It's like running a marathon with no finish line in sight.
Yeah.
And then on top of that exhaustion, you have the added layer of social anxiety, which the articles really emphasize as a major struggle for high-masking autistic individuals.
And it becomes this vicious cycle.
Right.
Masking to alleviate social anxiety.
Right.
But the act of masking itself is exhausting and can actually worsen the anxiety over time.
Right.
Imagine the pressure of constantly second-guessing every social interaction.
Yeah.
Terrified of saying or doing the wrong thing
Mm-hmm.
and being perceived as weird or different.
It's like you're walking on eggshells all the time.
Yeah.
Never quite sure if you're going to crack one.
Right.
And I can only imagine how isolating that must feel,
Yeah.
especially if you're already dealing with the mental exhaustion of masking.
And that's where I think that third struggle comes in. You know, the one that really struck me in these articles.
Yeah.
Identity issues.
Right.
Because if you're constantly masking who you are,
Mm-hmm.
how do you even begin to answer the question, who am I,
Right.
when you're not even sure yourself?
It's like looking in the mirror and seeing a reflection that doesn't quite feel like you.
Yeah.
And that disconnect, that sense of not being fully known even by yourself, that can be incredibly isolating.
Absolutely.
One of the articles gave this example of an individual who'd been masking since childhood, and they were so used to adapting to these different social situations that they felt like they lost sight of their authentic self.
It's like becoming a chameleon.
Right.
Blending into every environment, but never truly belonging anywhere.
Yeah.
And that lack of a solid sense of self can impact everything.
Right.
From relationships to career choices.
Because how do you build genuine connections when you're not even sure what parts of yourself are real and what parts are the mask?
Right.
It's like trying to build a house on a foundation that's constantly shifting.
And that brings us to a crucial point that these articles really drive home.
Okay.
The fluid nature of support needs.
Okay.
We tend to put people in boxes, right?
Right.
Like labeling them as high support or low support. But the reality is far more nuanced than that.
Yeah.
Someone might seem incredibly high functioning in one environment, but then completely fall apart in another.
Like that example we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
The person who's charming the room at a work event, but then goes home and has a complete meltdown because they can finally let the mask drop.
Exactly.
It's a good reminder that we're only seeing a fraction of what's going on beneath the surface.
And that's why it's so important to move beyond those labels and recognize that support needs aren't fixed.
Right.
They fluctuate depending on the individual, the environment, the situation.
It's like saying everyone needs the same size shoe. It just doesn't make sense.
Right.
So how do we as friends, family members, coworkers, even strangers, get better at recognizing those needs when they're not always obvious?
Yeah.
The articles do offer some really practical steps that we can all take to create a more supportive world for those on the spectrum.
The first step, and I can't emphasize this enough, is about creating safe spaces.
Okay.
And I don't just mean physical spaces,
Okay.
although that's important too,
Yeah.
but emotional spaces
Okay.
where autistic individuals feel seen, heard,
Yeah.
and accepted for who they are, masks off.
So like a haven from the constant performance of masking.
Exactly.
The place where they can finally exhale and just be.
Exactly. It could be a quiet room at home with sensory-friendly features,
Yeah.
a support group where they can connect with others who understand, or even just a conversation with a trusted friend where they feel safe to be vulnerable.
It's about recognizing that what might seem like a small gesture of understanding or acceptance can actually make a world of difference for someone who's used to navigating a world that doesn't always get it.
And that leads perfectly to the next step, promoting awareness.
Right.
Because the more we understand about autism,
Yeah.
about neurodiversity,
Right.
the more equipped we are to create those safe spaces,
Yeah.
those havens of acceptance.
It's about moving beyond stereotypes and misconceptions and recognizing the full spectrum of human experience.
Yeah.
The articles actually mention that often the biggest barrier for autistic individuals isn't the autism itself, it's the lack of understanding and acceptance from the world around them.
Which is why education is key.
Right.
Learning about the spectrum,
Yeah.
challenging our own biases, and engaging in open and honest conversations.
Right.
These are all crucial steps in fostering a more inclusive society.
Yeah.
The articles talk about the importance of listening to autistic voices, amplifying their stories,
Right.
and letting them lead the way in terms of what kind of support they need.
Because at the end of the day, they're the experts on their own experience, right?
Yeah.
We can't assume to know what's best for someone else.
And that ties into the idea of tailoring support approaches.
Right.
What works for one person might not work for another.
Yeah.
And that's okay.
Right.
The key is to approach each individual with a sense of curiosity, asking questions, listening to their needs, and being flexible in our approach.
It reminds me of that saying, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing the diversity within the spectrum and celebrating those differences rather than trying to force everyone into the same mold.
And that's where the idea of neurodiversity comes in. Embracing the idea that there's no one right way to think,
Right.
to learn or interact with the world.
Yeah.
The articles even mention studies that suggest that autistic individuals bring unique strengths and perspectives to the table,
Okay.
often excelling in areas like pattern recognition,
Interesting.
problem solving, and attention to detail.
It's like we're so focused on fitting everyone into these neat little boxes,
Right.
that we forget to appreciate the incredible tapestry of human experience.
Yeah.
And that's what these articles really challenged me to think about.
Yeah.
How can we move beyond just accepting difference to truly celebrating and valuing those differences.
A powerful shift in perspective, and it requires us to confront our own biases and assumptions.
Right.
We've talked about creating safe spaces, promoting awareness, tailoring support.
Uh-huh.
But I think it all boils down to something even more fundamental.
Okay.
Embracing the beauty of neurodiversity.
Yeah. And that brings us back to the idea of unmasking. Because ultimately, creating a world that embraces neurodiversity means creating a world where masking isn't necessary.
Right.
But as we've discussed, unmasking can be a deeply personal and often challenging process.
It's like taking off a suit of armor that you've been wearing for so long that it's become a part of you.
Right.
Even if it's heavy and restrictive, it feels familiar.
Yeah.
Safe.
Right.
So the idea of taking it off, even in a space that's supposed to be safe, can feel terrifying.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to approach unmasking with a sense of compassion.
Yeah.
Both for ourselves and for others.
Right.
It's not about forcing anyone to unmask before they're ready.
Right.
It's about creating an environment where they feel supported, accepted, and empowered to do so at their own pace.
One of the articles used this really powerful analogy.
Okay.
They compared unmasking to learning to swim.
I like that.
At first, you might cling to the edge of the pool, afraid to let go. But with patience, encouragement, and the right support, you can eventually learn to trust yourself in the water, to move freely, and experience the joy of swimming.
I love that analogy because it highlights that unmasking isn't about becoming someone different.
Okay.
It's about allowing yourself to be who you already are without the weight of constant masking.
Yeah.
And that can be a beautiful and liberating experience,
Yeah.
both for the individual and for those around them.
Because when we allow ourselves to be seen in our authentic, unfiltered state, we open ourselves up to deeper, more meaningful connections.
Right.
We show the world who we truly are.
Mm.
And in doing so, we give others permission to do the same.
It's like we're all holding our breath, waiting for someone else to take the first plunge.
Right.
But the truth is we don't have to wait for permission.
Right.
We can choose to be the ones who create those safe spaces, the ones who show up with compassion and understanding, the ones who embrace neurodiversity in all its forms.
And that's a really empowering thought to end on, isn't it?
Yeah.
That each of us has the power to make a difference, to create a world where everyone feels seen, heard, and valued for who they truly are.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, however, I want to thank you, dear listener, for joining us on this journey of discovery.
Yeah.
I hope these insights from the articles you shared have sparked some new thoughts and maybe even inspired you to look at the world through a slightly different lens.
Remember, this is just the beginning of the conversation. Keep asking questions. Keep learning. Keep challenging your own assumptions. And most importantly, keep embracing the beautiful diversity of the human experience.
Beautifully said. Until next time, take care.